Hello. The episode you're about to listen to is part of a multi-part series introducing an overview of Japanese history. This is a repeat of one of the original projects the History of Japan podcast was built on, and is intended to serve as an update and supplement to these original works. After 10 years, my hope is to return to this approach and to do it a little bit better given the skills that I have improved in the intervening years. If you haven't been doing so already, you should listen to these episodes sequentially, starting with episode 501. Without any further ado, enjoy the episode. Hello and welcome to the History of Japan podcast, episode 515, Slouching Towards Kyoto. For my money, one of the most interesting recurring debates in history as a discipline, and one we're going to turn to quite a bit over the coming months, is the question of what drives the events of history themselves. Is history the result of complex, long-term, impersonal changes in social, economic, and political trends? In other words, is historical change driven by systems, which are larger than any of us? Or is it driven by the actions of individuals, whose presence or absence at key moments determines how things unfold? The reality, of course, likely lies somewhere in the middle, but where exactly? That's a hard question to answer, and I think the difficulties of it are illustrated nicely by the downfall of the Kamakura Bakufu. We've been covering over the last few weeks the growing weaknesses of the government of the Hojo clan, set up in Kamakura on the eastern side of Honshu to maintain and reward the coalition of warrior families which had won the Genpei War. Victory over the Mongol invasions had been very costly, and the systems set up to reward Japan's warriors for service did not operate very well when victory didn't come with lands or treasure to redistribute. Similarly, the growing independence of the provinces from central control made it harder and harder for the Bakufu, the shogunal government, to capture and distribute revenue to its own followers, meaning said followers saw less and less of a point to Hojo rule since they were not getting as much out of it. Similarly, while the Hojo system was increasingly stable as the decades went on, it was ultimately a political structure based on personal alliances between the lead branch of the Hojo family and its supporters, alliances which could shift and collapse fairly quickly. For example, in 1285, the Adachi family, marital family and longtime supporters of the regent Hojo Tokiyori, was purged en masse. Tokiyori had died the previous year, and his son and heir was supported by rival families who wanted the Adachis cleared out to make room for their own kind of influence. This kind of thing makes for a very entertaining historical drama, but it is not, to put it mildly, great for producing stable or sane governance. The Hojo government also had a hard time controlling the warrior class itself, which ostensibly was the whole point of the Bakufu. Particularly in the provinces, banditry, or more accurately renegade samurai who just took whatever they wanted as taxes from a local estate, and who refused to allow legal verdicts to rein in their acquisitiveness, remained a serious issue. The renegade Jito, samurai charged with protecting Shoen estates, who in turn went around and extorted the estates without regard to the legal limits on their powers, were kind of iconic figures of the late Kamakura period, and that, frankly, is not, as the youth say, a good look. All of this meant that over time, various interest groups that had once supported the Kamakura government, provincial warriors, major samurai families from the Kanto area, and so on, became increasingly tepid on its future. And this in turn helps explain why, when things finally came down to it, the whole thing collapsed like a house of cards. Still, this explains why the Kamakura Bakufu eventually fell apart, but not who started tearing it down, or why. To answer those questions, we need to leave the realm of big systemic issues and start looking at individuals and their presence or absence in the historical record. And to do that, we have to return to an old stage for our story, Kyoto. The imperial capital was not, to be clear, absent from politics during the age of the Kamakura government. The Kyoto court continued to operate much as it had for centuries. Indeed, we sometimes refer to this period in Japanese history as one of dual government for exactly that reason. However, the civilian government of the Kyoto court was very clearly subordinated to the military one at Kamakura during this time period, particularly after the abortive Jokyu rebellion of 1221, when the retired Emperor Go-Toba tried and failed to claw back some power to Kyoto by force. After his rebellion failed and Go-Toba was exiled, the Kamakura Bakufu replaced him with a more pliant relative, Go-Saga, who first as emperor and then as retired emperor would dominate politics in Kyoto for decades until his death in 1272. While in power, Go-Saga's tenure was defined by his support for the Hojo and the Kamakura government, naturally enough, given that they were the ones who put him there in the first place. However, after his death, things started to get messy, thanks to what else but a good old-fashioned succession crisis entirely of Go-Saga's own making. As was the wont of aristocratic men of the time, Go-Saga had multiple female partners and thus a great many sons. As had been the case with retired emperors before him, he rotated these sons through the imperial seat as figureheads through whom he could run things, but he showed a clear preference and favoritism for his second son, Emperor Kameyama. This, naturally enough, did not much please his eldest son, Emperor Go-Fukakusa, who'd actually been made to retire in favor of Kameyama, and who did not like being pushed into a secondary role despite being the older of the two. Go-Saga's death thus created a dispute between supporters of Go-Fukakusa, who believed the succession going forward should flow through him as the eldest son, and those of Kameyama, who believed that the old emperor's clear preference for the second son meant that Kameyama's line should be the main branch of the family. Now, this all involves some very complicated political wrangling that we don't really have time to fully summarize here, but fortunately, if you are interested, all you have to do is go back to episode 454, which is all about one of the women at court during this time, Lady Nijo. Lady Nijo was intimately involved in the details of this moment, and I do mean intimately. She was a concubine of Go-Fukakusa, who was exiled from Kyoto because of an affair she had with his hated half-brother Kameyama. Her life is extremely fascinating in its own right, and for the window it offers into Kyoto politics during this time, so again, if you're interested in more about this subject specifically, check out episode 454. In the end, in terms of the succession dispute, the Kamakura Bakufu had to step in to head off a division in Kyoto. Remember, this is all happening during the middle of the Mongol invasions, so not an ideal time for the Kyoto government to be turning on itself in this way. The brokered solution arrived at eventually in 1287 was a divided succession. Go-Fukakusa's heirs would alternate on the throne with Kameyama's, maintaining a balance between them and between the various factions in Kyoto and Kamakura, who saw some benefit in supporting one side over the other. And for a time, this balance worked. Go-Fukakusa was, by the traditional count, Japan's 89th emperor. His younger half-brother Kameyama was number 90. For the next 5 imperial reigns, the succession would alternate effectively back and forth between the imperial lines, until we get to number 96, known to history as Emperor Go-Daigo. Go-Daigo was born under the name Prince Takaharu in 1288. He was from the Kameyama branch of the family, the younger brother, and the son of the 91st Emperor Go-Uda and brother of the 94th, Go-Nijo. His second cousin, Hanazono, grandson of Go-Fukakusa, was elevated to the throne in 1308, and thus following the agreement created by the Kamakura shogunate, Go-Daigo, who was from the opposite line, became crown prince. 10 years later, Hanazono would abdicate to focus on raising his nephew and children as future heirs, and because he personally was more interested in Rinzai sect Zen and the composition of waka poetry than politics, and so Go-Daigo came to the throne. Now, by this time, the split between the rival imperial family lines had gone from personal sibling rivalry to a question of high politics. You see, the division within the imperial line didn't just affect the succession itself. Each line also maintained independent properties like shoen tax-free estates, for example, which it tried to pass down through relatives and political allies. This could make for some very tense political disputes because serious money was on the line. For example, in 1300, the two lines had a huge blow-up when Muromachi-in, a Buddhist nun who was a daughter of one of the emperors from before this whole dispute had started, died. The death was not terribly unexpected. She was 72. But she'd also inherited over 100 shoen from her family after her brother died unexpectedly. And while Muromachi-in's direct relatives were allied to the Go-Fukakusa side of the family, the opposite one from Emperor Go-Daigo, before she'd become a nun, she had married into the Kameyama side, and as a result, by the laws of the time, would pass the shoen over to the Kameyama side through her children after her death. And this meant, in essence, that 100 shoen worth of wealth was about to swap sides in one go, completely upending the balance of power within Kyoto. The Go-Fukakusa side was naturally a bit peeved at this prospect, and the tensions between all involved got to be such that the Kamakura government had to step in again and mediate a solution, dividing the shoen 50-50 between the two branches, if you're wondering. The division between the two lines wasn't just economic either, it was cultural. The Kameyama line, for example, became famous for patronizing new cultural developments out of China. For example, they brought over some of the first scholars of Neo-Confucianism, a Confucian revivalist movement that would dominate Chinese politics for the next millennium, and were also big supporters of Zen Buddhism and Chinese-style arts like calligraphy. Not to be outdone, the Go-Fukakusa line became major patrons of the older Japanese Buddhist sects like Tendai, and of more traditional Japanese arts like waka poetry to compensate. What I'm getting at is that by the time Go-Daigo inherited the throne, Kyoto was a city deeply divided between these rival factions in a very profound way. Go-Daigo himself, meanwhile, was, from what we can tell, a man of profound ability. For example, he made an effort to staff his court with men of actual talent, including those from the opposing Go-Fukakusa line. He was also very interested in the details of policy. He was actually responsible for transforming taxation rules in Kyoto itself, for the first time imposing taxes on artisans such as sake brewers, rather than relying just on direct taxation of peasants. When a famine struck Kyoto in 1330, he intervened directly to pass edicts ordering price stabilization and the opening of government granaries to feed the population. By the way, the name Go-Daigo itself is actually a bit of a hint at this new emperor's talent and ambitions. The Go in Go-Daigo is a prefix meaning ladder, which is why sometimes you also see Go-Daigo rendered in older English sources as Daigo II. Emperor Daigo, or if you prefer Daigo I, ruled back in the 900s. He was one of very few emperors early in the Heian period who was not dominated by Fujiwara clan regents, and who attempted with some success to re-centralize power under the imperial family, though his successors would not do very well at maintaining that legacy. Go-Daigo would not have been known by that name during his own reign. Until his death, he would have been referred to simply as the Emperor, and would have continued to use his personal name Takaharu when signing edicts. Similarly, the current emperor is referred to publicly as Naruhito. It's only after he dies or abdicates that he'll be officially styled Emperor Reiwa. Anyway, Go-Daigo was always open about his desire to emulate his illustrious ancestor Daigo and returning more power to the emperors, and his posthumous styling is almost certainly a tribute to his ambition. His hopes, however, were stymied from the jump. Around the time of his death, the senior-most member of the opposing Go-Fukakusa side of the imperial family died, and there were serious worries the balance of power between the two branches was going to tip again. Once more, the Kamakura Bakufu intervened to mediate a settlement to prevent a breakdown in the imperial capital. As a part of that settlement, Go-Daigo's position as the new emperor was reaffirmed. However, the Bakufu also decreed that so as to prevent Go-Daigo from centralizing too much power in his side of the family, none of his children could ever inherit the imperial throne. Without that ability, raising his own heirs and preparing them to hang on to the power he intended to win, Go-Daigo was going to have a hell of a time actually succeeding in building a lasting legacy for the imperial court. Perhaps, like Daigo himself, he was doomed to spend his whole life working to strengthen the imperial line, only to see his successors undo all that work without him there to ensure they didn't. And it's likely because of this very decree that Go-Daigo began to contemplate turning against the Kamakura Bakufu. After all, if they were not there to enforce their decisions anymore, well, then it wouldn't really matter. The moment to strike also seemed opportune. The last time an emperor had tried to turn against the warriors of Kamakura more than a century ago, those warriors had been united by a shared purpose, and by the leadership of Hojo Masako. Now the great nun shogun was almost 100 years gone, and the Hojo themselves were very divided. In 1311, the Hojo Shikken, or regent, was replaced by a 9-year-old after the incumbent died, and that 9-year-old was, well, 9, and not a great leader, and at any rate resigned in 1326 because he hated politics. After that point, the Hojo spent the next 4 years merrily trying to kill each other via a series of increasingly convoluted assassination plots I will not even bother you with in order to determine who was going to take over, not that it matters much because it's all going to be irrelevant soon anyway. At the same time, Hojo authority in the provinces was weakening. The bandit problem among the Shoin estates was getting worse and worse, and in many cases local warriors actually supported those bandits, who after all were generally fellow samurai trying to sustain themselves off of illegal taxes from local lands, and didn't really care that much about the decrees of the distant Hojo, who were invested in protecting the property rights of Shoin estate holders. Decrees from Kamakura trying to bring the bandit problem under control, for example a 1324 one demanding Shoin owners hand over any captured rogue warriors or face having their lands confiscated, were routinely ignored. And it's really not a great sign for your government when people just start flat out ignoring the things you say, especially as was the case here, when you're unable to make them face any consequences for doing so. Go-Daigo was many things, but he was not a fool, and he could see the faltering of the Kamakura government plainly. From what we can tell, as early as the first years of the 1320s, he had begun to plot a rebellion against the Bakufu, and lay the groundwork for it. Unlike the Jokyu rebellion of Emperor Go-Saga a century earlier, Go-Daigo was patient. For example, he carefully maneuvered 2 of his sons to the top of the Tendai sect temple of Enryakuji atop Mount Hiei, bringing the influential clerics and the wealthy temple lands, as well as a good-sized army which defended them, around to his cause. He also cultivated members of the warrior class opposed to the Hojo, most notably the Hino family, a group of Kyoto aristocrats who had switched vocations to become warriors a few centuries earlier. Go-Daigo relied upon the Hino to reach out to their fellow warriors, especially those living outside of the traditional bastion of support for the Kamakura Bakufu in the Kanto Plains, and convince them to jump ship. However, the Hino conspiracy to mobilize forces against the Bakufu was successfully detected by agents of Kamakura's Rokuhara Tandai, the group responsible for monitoring goings-on in Kyoto on behalf of the Kamakura government, not once, but twice in 1324 and again in 1331. The first time, Go-Daigo was able to successfully argue he had nothing to do with these men raising an army in his name, and got away relatively unscathed. The second time, this proved a harder sell, to put it mildly, and Go-Daigo ended up having to flee Kyoto a few days later for Nara, where he fortified himself atop Mount Kasagi and called for all his loyalists to join him. This did not produce terribly inspiring results. The Kamakura Bakufu promptly mobilized an army, scattered Go-Daigo's defenders, captured the emperor, and forced him to abdicate. He was shipped off to the Oki Islands in the Japan Sea, now a part of Shimane Prefecture and, essentially, with respect to the people of Shimane Prefecture, the middle of nowhere. You would think this would be it for Go-Daigo. His loyalists beaten, his armies scattered, he himself forced into distant exile. Shockingly, it was not. And really, a lot of the credit for that has to be given to one of Go-Daigo's sons, known to history as Prince Morinaga. Morinaga was one of the two sons Go-Daigo had worked to put into place in the leadership of Enryakuji atop Mount Hiei, hoping to bring the temple's wealth and military might to bear for his cause. From what I can tell, at least, Morinaga didn't really care that much about Tendai sect Buddhism. Certainly it didn't take up much of his energy and time. He cared far more about politics and helping his father succeed. After Go-Daigo was exiled, Morinaga became the head of the Kameyama branch, his side of the imperial line, while the Go-Fukakusa one was placed back atop the imperial throne by the Bakufu. Morinaga carefully bided his time, quietly rallying more support among the warriors of central Japan and, crucially, reaching out to the so-called Akuto, the bandits of the provinces. Remember, many of these so-called bandits were just members of the warrior class who, for one reason or another, had gotten into it with the Kamakura Bakufu, usually over property rights related to their shoen. They were perfectly good fighters, indeed usually pretty practiced ones, and useful people to have on your side. Morinaga was patient in building his support, but by the 11th lunar month of 1332, so about a year and a half into his father's exile, he had left Enryakuji and was openly rallying followers in the Yoshino area of Yamato province, about 100 kilometers or 61 miles south of Kyoto. As news of this got out, Prince Morinaga was joined by one of the followers of his father's original uprising, and someone we do simply have to talk about, Kusunoki Masashige. Now, Kusunoki Masashige is one of those figures whose story is so wrapped up in legend and myth that it's hard to separate historical fact from later fiction, for reasons we'll get into more in the future. Indeed, very little is known of Kusunoki before this time. The Taiheki, the dramatized history of the conflicts we're about to discuss, describes him as being descended from Tachibana no Moroe, a major figure of Nara heir politics. He was one of the backers of Empress Kolken, who we talked about back in episode 505, as well as a distant relative of the Minamoto clan. None of that biography for Kusunoki is backed by any other source, and one thing we'll see is that sources from pre-modern Japan have a tendency to invent illustrious backgrounds for famous people out of absolutely nothing. All we know for sure is that Kusunoki Masashige, born in 1294, was a minor landholder in Kawachi province, what's now Osaka, who answered Go-Daigo's original call to rise up in 1331 with a few hundred men under his command. After Go-Daigo was defeated and exiled, Kusunoki Masashige did not do what most of his compatriots did, except defeat and hang it up. Instead, he kept fighting, leading a guerrilla campaign against the Kamakura shogunate for the next year and a half, while harassing their forces as best he could. And when he got word of Prince Morinaga's second uprising, well, he naturally enough joined that too. And here, the tides of fortune began to shift dramatically against the Kamakura Bakufu. Prince Morinaga, knowing a seasoned commander when he saw one, naturally placed Masashige in command of a good chunk of his forces. Masashige then advanced and, in the first lunar month of 1333, defeated an army sent by Kamakura to stop him in the vicinity of Shitennoji in what's now Osaka. The Bakufu counterattack was not long in coming and drove Masashige out of the fortified Akasaka Castle in the foothills of Osaka. However, he was able to escape with most of his army intact and retreat back to Chihaya Castle further up in the mountains. And when the Bakufu forces followed him there, they were greeted with the classic tactics of the Akuto bandit. Kusunoki Masashige relied on ambushes and raids on the Bakufu besiegers, and tricks like the use of straw dummies to hide weaknesses in his defense, bleeding the Bakufu besiegers and trapping them in the valley leading up to Chihaya itself. From here, things snowballed pretty badly. Rebellions against the Bakufu by anti-Hojo warriors cropped up in Harima and Iyo provinces, modern Hyogo and Ehime prefectures, by the end of the first month. Go-Daigo, getting wind of what was going on, slipped his captors on the Oki Islands and raised a new army to return to Kyoto. At this point, the Kamakura Bakufu, finally realizing how badly things were going, mobilized two armies in the eastern Kanto to send to Kyoto and crush the rebellion. One of these was led by a guy named Nagaoshi Takaiie, whose name I probably shouldn't have bothered you with, because he will promptly stumble into a trap set by one of Go-Daigo's loyalists, Akamatsu Norimura, and get himself and all his followers killed. The other army, however, was led by someone we really need to talk about, whose name was Ashikaga Takauji. Now, I think it's fair to call Takauji the most controversial figure from this entire period. Once again, he's one of those guys who makes separating myth from legend pretty challenging. Fortunately, that complexity has more to do with his motivations than it does with his origins. You see, the Ashikaga were already a pretty prominent family by this time period. They were distantly related to the Seiwa line of the Minamoto family. They traced their lineage back to one Minamoto no Yoshiyasu, grandson of the famous Yoshi-Ie, and distant cousin to Yoritomo. Yoshiyasu had thus fought on the Minamoto side of the Hogen and Heiji rebellions, and survived to fight in the Genpei War on the Minamoto side too. For his troubles, Yoshiyasu and his son Yoshikane, who joined him on the battlefield for the Genpei War, were rewarded with Jito manager rights over a Shoen estate in Shimotsuke Province, today Tochigi Prefecture north of Tokyo, named Ashikaga no Sho. Eventually, Yoshiyasu began to call himself Ashikaga Yoshiyasu to distinguish himself from the other Minamoto. Yoshiyasu's son Yoshikane also married into the Hojo family, so after Yoritomo's death in 1199 and the 2.5-decade mess that followed it, the Ashikaga naturally shifted alliances over to the Hojo. Indeed, the name Ashikaga appears pretty prominently in the list of pro-Hojo forces from accounts of conflicts throughout the Kamakura Bakufu's history. And all that history made Ashikaga Takauji a pretty natural choice as commander of a pro-Hojo army sent to deal with Go-Daigo once and for all. Except that's not quite how things went down. You see, Takauji took his army and marched west from the Kanto in the spring of 1333. By this point, Kyoto was already the site of battles between pro and anti-Hojo forces, and Takauji's armies would tip the scales decisively, particularly because he first made his way to Tamba province north of Kyoto, home to many followers of his mother's family, the Uesugi, to bolster his forces further. However, then the unexpected happened. Takauji switched sides. When exactly Takauji made the determination to jump ship is unclear, though we do know he was in contact with Go-Daigo's forces for a while before he officially jumped ship. So too is why. One of the tricky things about this period, and much of Japanese history before the last century or so, is that the major leaders didn't really keep diaries all that often, or if they did, they were kept secret and never made publicly available. This contrasts quite a bit with, say, big chunks of European history, where you have things like family letters or diaries that are much more explicit about the internal lives and motivations of participants in major events. Thus, we are left to do a lot of speculating as to the motives of major historical figures. In the case of Ashikaga Takauji, it's often suggested he turned on the Hojo at least in part out of a sense that he'd been slighted by the Kamakura Bakufu, that the Hojo had not sufficiently honored him, and thus he would betray them. This is the version given by the Taiheki, where Takauji responds angrily to an order to both fight for Kamakura and take a special renewed oath of loyalty before he marched off to battle. Quote, "The Shikken Hojo Takatoki is but a descendant of Hojo Tokimasa, whose clan long ago came down among the commoners, while I am of the generation of the House of Minamoto, which left the imperial family not long since. Surely it is meant that Takatoki should be my vassal, instead of contemptuously handing down orders such as these." Another theory involves the Ashikaga Shoen from which the family took its name. Remember, the Ashikaga were the Jito of that estate, responsible for managing its security and relations with the warrior population. But who was the actual owner? Well, the Ashikaga Shogun actually belonged to the imperial family, specifically to the Kameyama branch from which Go-Daigo was descended. So perhaps Takauji saw himself as owing his loyalty to the imperial line and Go-Daigo. It's also sometimes suggested, and frankly I think this is the most convincing, that Takauji saw the Bakufu for what it had become, weak, riven with factionalism, and unable to effectively control the country. Thus, he decided that fighting to preserve it was not worthwhile and that a new government would do a better job. These are very interesting questions to consider because the debate on what motivated Takauji is very important for discussions of his character and his historical reputation. While I do think the last example is the most credible, I don't think there's an easy answer to the question of his motives, and I do want to be clear that I'm relaying my opinion here, an opinion that is grounded more in a broad sense of Takauji than anything else, so take it for what it's worth for you. You see, I'm a believer that you can get a clear sense of someone's character from their actions, that in essence, a person is what they do. And I do get a sense, I think, of at least part of Takauji's character from his actions over the next few years. The main thing that jumps out to me is that he's a pragmatist. Takauji was motivated simply by a political instinct to do what advanced his own interest, without a lot of concern for the long-term consequences. I think next week especially you'll see this very clearly. Read through this lens, Takauji's betrayal of the Hojo is simple enough to explain. He saw an opportunity to advance his interests, and he took it. But again, that's just my read on things. Regardless, with Takauji on his side, Go-Daigo's forces swiftly took Kyoto early in the 5th lunar month of 1333. The Hojo loyalists stationed in the capital fled the city with the emperor installed to replace Go-Daigo, known to history as Emperor Kogon, but didn't make it long before they were captured, with the Hojo warriors escorting the emperor, either dying in the fighting or committing suicide to avoid capture. The day before Kogon was captured, Hojo rule in Kamakura itself collapsed. The culprit was one final betrayal. Nitayoshi Sada, a warrior who had fought for the Hojo previously, he'd actually fought Kusunoki Masashige at the Battle of Chihaya Castle, had later decided to swap sides. His motives, again, are unclear. The Taiheki says he was treated poorly by a taxation official sent to his personal shoen. Other sources say he was convinced to jump ship by Go-Daigo's own son, Prince Morinaga, who was by all accounts a pretty charismatic guy in his own right. Regardless, Nitayoshi Sada raised an army from his home in Kosuke province in the interior of Honshu and marched on Kamakura. Despite being outnumbered initially by Hojo defenders of the city, he was able to defeat Hojo armies several times, thanks largely either to defections to his cause, by warriors who could see which way the wind was blowing, or by local samurai or bandits who joined him out of hatred of the Hojo. Again, precisely one day before Emperor Kogon and his followers were captured retreating towards Kamakura, Nitayoshi Sada's forces broke through the final defenses of the city itself. They annihilated the remaining defenders and torched a good chunk of the city. Hojo family members and loyalists generally died fighting or committed suicide. Hojo rule and the Kamakura Bakufu were over. Within the week, Go-Daigo would issue an edict, still on his way to Kyoto, removing Emperor Kogon as emperor and returning himself to the throne, and vacating the twin positions of shogun and shikken. He had, it appeared, succeeded. Power had been restored to the emperor and to the imperial throne. We call this period the Kenmu Restoration. It was, after all, an era of restored imperial political power, and Go-Daigo changed the Nengo or era name upon taking the throne to Kenmu, a phrase that's kind of hard to translate. Ken is the character for build or construct, Mu is arms, warrior, or more poetically, chivalry. So something like raising the martial spirit, I suppose, a recognition on Go-Daigo's part of what had enabled his rise to power. Because while Go-Daigo's rule on the one hand represented a return to an older arrangement of power, with the imperial family clearly at the center, on the other it wasn't much of a change. After all, it was warrior families who backed him that enabled his victory over the Hojo. Most central to his new regime were three warriors in particular. Kusunoki Masashige, that early loyalist who'd stuck by Go-Daigo's cause even in its darkest hour, was naturally one of them. Ashikaga Takauji, whose betrayal had turned the tide of battle against the Hojo in Kyoto, was another. And then there was Nitayoshi Sada, who had finished off the Hojo for good. With their support, Go-Daigo set about establishing a new government and rewarding his followers. For example, Takauji got a court rank, junior 4th grade, the privilege of using one of the characters from Go-Daigo's own personal name, the Taka in Takaharu is also the Taka in Takauji, as well as the governorship of 2 provinces, Shugo rights over another, and a whole truckload of landholdings. Surely we are now on the cusp of a new age of political stability under the revived Kyoto government. And I'm checking my notes here, and next week it all comes crashing down into a massive civil war. That sounds bad, but we'll get to it next week. That's all for this week. Thank you very much for listening. This show is a part of the Facing Backward podcast network. You can find out more about this show and our other shows at facingbackward.com, and you can support the network at patreon.com/facingbackward. Special thanks to those who have given at our shoutout tier: Jan Leonard, Stephen Elkins, Martin Oliveira, Clark Canning, Ian Kellett, Matt Haynes, Jackie Frostocker, Monkey Sack, Alayla McCulloch, Karen Murphy, Peter Wales, Robert Prine, William, Arno, Jonas Brandis, Nicholas Kroll, Jerry Spinrad, Jared Stevens, Jeffrey Dwork, Stefan Hrushka, Joshua Kane, Robbie and Kat, Jacob Key, Aaron Finkbeiner, and Anonymous Anna's Hummingbird, Mark Sai, Gil, Leslie Ikuta, Trash Taste Enjoyer, Harrison Reese, Robbie Martin McAvoy, Inoue Enrio's Ghostbusters, NihongoKaizen.com, Shimao Toshio's History of Japonesia podcast, A House is a Perfectly Cromulent Mascot, The Fish Eye Catch Our Rhodes Scholars compared to Samuel Alito, Schmuck, and Everything Changed when the Fire Nation attacked. Special thanks also to new donors to the History of Japan Patreon, Ed and Carrie, for donating to support the show. Thanks again for listening, and I'll see you next week for the downfall of the Kenmu Restoration government.